Georgia, let's start with where the seeds of this came from and how they germinated.
Yeah, so Hélène and I were already working together, and we were keen to tell a story about some of the things that were kind of on our minds at that moment. It was 5 years ago, and we were talking a lot about internalized homophobia and the performative element of self, the fact that we can be one person when we're at work and another person when we're with our families, in our relationships, etc. And that was kind of what we were talking about at the time. And then it was a complete kind of coincidence that I came across a newspaper article about Section 28, that specifically the lesbian abseilers who had abseiled from the public gallery of the House of Lords into the debate on Section 28. And despite the fact that I'd been at school for most of the time that Section 28 was in, I had not heard of it before. And I was struck by the fact that not many of my queer friends had either. And so I started immediately kind of piecing together aspects of my life and understanding things for the first time. And so I was thinking about that, but I was also thinking about what it must have been like for a teacher at that time. And Hélène and I went on to meet a handful of women who had worked as PE teachers in the late 80s and early 90s, along with many, many, many other people who contributed, from giving us diary entries and people who'd been activists at the time, people who'd lived in Newcastle, queer members of the community in Newcastle who could tell us about the bars. It was a long thing.
And Hélène, can you say a bit more about the role of development in the process, and why Newcastle, for instance, and anything else that you think is interesting to share about what you learned on the journey of developing this project?
I think from my perspective, the role in development was really helping. Georgia had a clear idea in her mind about what this film was and who Jean was, but it was about translating that onto the page. And we must have discussed every single word on that script for I don't know how many drafts. But it was because it's such a multi-layered, complex, nuanced portrait that every single word, every single comma really mattered in trying to get this across for people to understand. Because I felt like I understood intimately what Georgia wanted to do, because I had similar experiences, but it was about helping other people who did not share those experiences understand what it was. And for Newcastle, we spoke to a lot of people in the north of England. We spoke to a lot of people in the south of England. There was a clear north-south divide in their experience. Manchester was the queer capital at the time, so we knew we didn't want to set it there because Jean would have too much of a support system if she was in somewhere like London or Manchester. But we still needed to set it somewhere where there was still a queer community, so not complete countryside. And Georgia had studied in Newcastle, and she had family there, so it something that you knew from the start, the geography of the place and where the character could go from one space to another, from North Shields to South Shields. And with our script editor, we talked a lot about the different zones where Jean evolved, and how she behaved in different ways depending on where she was. And so I feel like you had a good knowledge of the geography and
the texture of that place. And we talked about the physical barriers that these teachers had shared with us that they'd put in place. They purposefully lived on the other side of the river from the school, or purposefully lived quite far from the kind of queer epicenter of that city for obvious reasons. And so Newcastle made sense for me for that reason.
And Rosy, when did your relationship with this project start, and what did you see? What connected?
I was on board about a year before we started shooting, and I had never heard of Section 28, and I was very much at school when it was happening. It was abolished in 2003, and I wanted to be part of telling a story that just hadn't taken up enough space. And also Georgia's writing is so 3D. I mean, even in the stage direction, there's stuff that no one will ever see, and it should be sort of framed. But the detail that she gives in every element, Jean was on the page when I got the script, and that is such a luxury as an actor.
Mm-hmm. And what was the thing that made you first become Jean? You talked about a haircut.
The hair. I didn't want to do it. I said, I'm not. I wimped out. I said, I'm not doing it. And Georgia had a Zoom with me and said, it will be iconic. You have to do it.
She was not wrong.
It's the best thing I've ever done in my life.
That's not all I said.
That's the thing that stuck with me. And this sort of androgynous space that I stepped into was incredibly freeing. That, and then also her costume in tracksuits, you know, just sort of this sort of neutral, free space that she's like desperately trying to fill in her emotional life. She sort of gets there in her aesthetic, and I think that was probably the first step.
Mm-hmm. And Kerrie, your physical transformation's quite big to get into this character. Can you talk us through how much that helped you differentiate from you to the character?
I did the job. I mean, I had hair extensions down here from another job, fake nails down here. You know what I mean? And yeah, so it was a change, but it was necessary. Like I was obviously, I read in the script that she had shaved head, and I was like, okay, fine. But Georgia called me and was like, would you mind? And I was like, mate, it's fine. I'm gonna do it, because for me it was super important. I couldn't fake it. Like I also, as we were talking about earlier, as soon as I was given the role, I started dressing as the character, started changing my own, you know, how I carried myself, because I couldn't just turn up on set and just become Viv. I had to get there, you know.
Even before you got the part, right? You went.
Well, actually, yeah. It was kind of wishful thinking.
She went and got loads of piercings, extra piercings.
I went to Camden. My ear was like a bloody tomato. I got so many in one day, and I think because I was like, if I do get the part, then I'll need them, because I also I just didn't want. I mean, apart from the tattoos, obviously, because I don't have any of them, but. Yeah, I thought it was so important, and it helped tremendously.
She put me to shame with the hair.
Yeah, you were.
Kerrie arrived on day one,
crying, and I got
and I'd taken weeks to be convinced, and everyone was like, "Oh no, Rosie's not going to cut her."
I had to psych myself up for that call, and then Kerrie just cut me off and was like, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do it." And I was like,
I know. We had strategy discussions about how we're going to approach the hair with Kerrie.
But Kerrie, you talked also about how the way that you were looked at changed, and how much that started to help you access Viv.
Yeah, definitely.
Before you got to set.
Yeah, one thing I noticed was, especially being around men, and not so much to generalise, but how I carry myself around other men. For example, little things I didn't realise. I saw how I was seen differently, and maybe myself, like, stood in front of, not every man, just for the record, but just, you know, you have those little things of like, oh, you know, do you fancy each other? I don't know. But like, all of that was taken away, and I just saw, I was starting to see the world through Viv's eyes and not through my own. And that was because I was perceived as such. So that was very helpful. Yeah, definitely.
And Peter Tatchell's been promoting this film, I saw, was rather iconic part connection to Section 28. Can you talk a bit more about Catherine's role and that developing that story with her?
Yeah, so Catherine Lee and Sarah Squires were two of the PE teachers that we spoke to in those early early phases of development, but they then went on to become a huge part of the whole process. They were with us when we were filming. They were with us when the film finally premiered. And although I think that we had a version of the story before really speaking to Catherine properly, but we had decided that the story was going to be kind of catalyzed by the moment Jean saw her student in a bar, and Catherine had lived that exact experience, and we found that out afterwards. And So we spoke to her about it, and it just so happened that she had written down, she had diaries from that time, from that day, from walking into that bar, from writing how it felt to walk down the kind of beer-stained carpet staircase into the bar, and then being with her friends, and then seeing her student in a bar, and then her student coming to find her the next day and telling her something really vulnerably. And it's Catherine's story to tell, but what we took away from that conversation was just how clearly not a day had gone by that she hadn't thought about the way that she had behaved with that student, and that she wished that she could have behaved differently. And she said to Rosie during the prep that she just wished she could have been braver. And that was kind of the setup for the whole film, really. I thought it was such an interesting... We came up against quite a lot of... people would read the script and find Jean to be quite a difficult character, maybe a little bit hard to access, and the choices that she makes sometimes are obviously, questionable. But that was exactly the story that we wanted to tell, was what happens when all of these things co-conspire to create this insurmountable pressure that forces people to behave in a way that they wish that they hadn't, that they can't stop thinking about 30 years later. So, yeah, I mean, both Sarah and Catherine were a huge part of the film, and there are different aspects that they both contributed that, the film wouldn't be the film that it is without their contribution.
And Rosie and Kerrie, what tools and space did you locate to develop the ups and downs of your relationship? It's very, very powerful, very believable.
Georgia sent us bowling when we were rehearsing.
Yeah, no, we did.
As you do.
Yeah.
And she said, go make up your history. I don't want to know anything about it.
Yeah.
So Jean and Viv sort of started working out their history, just us two together. And then a few days before we started filming, we went to a gay bar in Newcastle in costume. And this girl was checking me out. And I was kind of enjoying it.
Yes.
And I turned around, and Kerrie, Viv, in her sort of leathers, sort of legs akimbo, started to get really jealous.
Yeah.
And then that made me get a bit giddy. And Jean and Viv were sort of born in that moment. And Kerrie's such a beautiful actor, and the further through we got in the shooting process, the more we kind of fell in love. And in the last scene at the party, we arrived on set and Kerrie wouldn't look at me. And I was like, hey, trying to hang out with her. We always used to hang out together on set, and she wouldn't look at me until the actual... And everyone was partying that day because we were all there filming this party scene. Everyone was hanging out, and I'd look over and Kerrie would be having a laugh, and I'd be like, hey, Kerrie. And she didn't look at me until that final shot where you see where Jean's having a cigarette and Viv comes out and they look at each other. So that took a whole day of like not and wanting to look at each other to get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, she was made aware of this. I wouldn't just like no, well, and it did help, didn't it? Because all day I was like starved of your like attention, and but we had to do that because we were so close on set because we put ourselves together. We had to be.
The way you look at her at the end.
Well, we hadn't looked at each other all day. It was quite.
So their chemistry was so intense so quickly that actually we had to. I remember spending more work trying to break that down, if that makes sense. Like there were a few times where I had to be like, guys, come on, this is actually not the moment. They're not, and they'd just be like looking at each other like doughy-eyed.
We cut a lot of their scenes actually
because of that.
Because they had too much chemistry, and it turned the film into a rom-com, which was never supposed to be. So we had to cut a lot of like they were dancing and hanging out, and that's all gone.
In the original ending, Jean doesn't go back inside the party. She stays outside, and it's more ambiguous about whether Jean and Viv get together. And
it's still ambiguous.
It's still ambiguous.
Yeah. Yes.
It's
You
still
end up together.
And I said, "Go on, she's got to go back in."
She was like, "Can we just film it, please? She's got to go back in." It's like, "Oh, okay, we'll do it, and then we'll get rid of it." And then we did it, and I was like, "Oh, come on."
The script was written. The last scene in the script was Jean heads back into and gets swallowed by like a wave. I mean, you wrote it better, but she gets swallowed by the the school and the students, and we're like, yeah, but if she goes back into the co-op, that's 2 scenes of her going back in somewhere, and it's gonna screw up the edit and stuff. But right, fine, let's do it.
Give them their happy ending.
We'll figure it out.
Can we talk about the iconography of the time, because it stands out. Period detail. Like, what does even authenticity mean? I'm not sure. We can discuss, but tapes, blind date, Walkmans, landlines, a nest of tables. They don't exist anymore, do they? It doesn't feel overpowering. So can you just talk about the how you work with your production designer, the color palette, all of the texture?
So from the beginning, we kind of set out to make a film that felt more of its time than looking back on that moment in history. So that was kind of dictating a lot of choices. We knew we were going to shoot on 16mm, and that was partly for aesthetic reasons, but also because I prefer the kind of intensity and the stakes that brings to the shooting experience, which in times got us into quite a lot of trouble, but actually I wouldn't change it. And then in terms of working with the costume designer and production designer, it was really just about finding heads of department that shared that vision, who were on board to create a version of the 80s that felt true to the time, but also not kind of too heavily signposting everything. And in terms of blind date and all of that side of things, that was more about the kind of barrage of heteronormative messaging that Jean would have experienced more so in an pre-internet world, pre-phone world, but arguably I would say we still have that barrage every day now. But yeah, so in terms of what's coming through the TV, the radio, the newspapers, all of that was just about trying to get into the character's head and understanding, what does it mean when there's one newspaper article, and there's one newspaper in the staff room, and that's the one that everyone's reading, and that newspaper has an article about a teacher being sacked in Bradford because of their sexuality, and whether or not that teacher was then reinstated may not even be caught. You might not even see that in the newspaper a few days later, but that's the thing that you take home. And so that was what fascinated us about Section 28, was that yes, there was this sort of looming threat of losing one's job, but actually the real threat was the paranoia and the sort of suffocating nature of it. And actually it wasn't as clear as that. It was about those messages embedding themselves inside your head, and then how you're made to feel about yourself as a result of it, more than the kind of more basic threat of losing one's job, because actually no teachers were prosecuted throughout that period. But the insidious nature of it doesn't make it any better, obviously.
And on to that point, actually, the film is so much about watching and being watched, and I'd love you all to speak about that from a performance level, and then also how you wrote that and planned the beat by beat of it, because it's really hard I'm sure it was hard for people to imagine the power of watching and being watched, and how much it's the journey of accepting being seen in a way that Jean wants to be seen ultimately at the end. And it's so powerful, the gaze, the way that Viv and Jean look at each other, all of those aspects. Can you talk a bit more about how you mapped that?
Yeah, well, there was always a lot in the scripts, a lot of looking, and that was quite problematic. I remember in development, people were...
There's nothing happening.
Yeah, and like, how are you gonna, the power in a look, you never know. It's all about performance, but so much about the relationship between the students and Jean, not just Lois and Jean, but also Siobhan and Lois and Jean. I remember there is a scene where they're playing netball, and Jean's doing the demonstration, and it said that there was a sort of fizzing three-way energy between them, and it was communicated on the page, but it was quite another thing trying to capture that, in real time without. But yeah, it was. We had so many conversations between me and the actors, between me and the heads of department about that, the nature of looking and the nature of being looked at, and all the things that have just been said about haircuts and things. That was a big part of it for me, was feeling what it feels like to be looked at in a certain way, and trying to understand that, when Lois arrives in the school, there is something that occurs between her and Jean. And it involves looking and it involves feeling, but it isn't that sort of quantifiable. And people would read the script and they'd say, is this about attraction? Do they fancy each other? And I'd be like, no, it's not about that. It's about two queer people in the same space kind of sniffing each other out and like not really knowing what they're doing, but it's sort of happening organically. And it's a really difficult thing to communicate, but that was sort of, to try and get people on board with that vision who hadn't necessarily experienced that themselves was a difficult task. But that was all really important for me from the beginning, and was all about kind of this thing of like watching and being watched, and how that changes, and how when someone like Lois gains power, how she then becomes the teacher almost. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Rosy and Kerrie, can you speak to that actually? Because there's some really powerful performance points where it's all in the eyes.
For me, it was sort of by location. I think her level of fear alters. Firstly, it goes from 0 to 100 in about a second, and that was always something that me and Georgia talked about. Like when she gets the phone call from Viv in the staff room, she's seemingly relaxed, but in an instant she's on high alert. And that comes from being watched. And it sort of feels like she's maneuvering herself in every situation, and she's being watched in a different way every time. And she's never quite free, even in her own home. The lights, her neighbor, there's always like this sense of like an ominous presence. And it's actually really, and I didn't anticipate this when I read the script. I only thought the time she really releases is at the very end, when she has a sort of laughing cry moment. But actually, when me and Kerrie met and Jean and Viv were born, it feels like with Viv, there's some kind of freedom there. But otherwise, in every different location, it's a different level of fear. It's a different mask. It's a different type of version of Jean that she's got to put on because of the fear that she's feeling.
Yeah, and myself on the other side was more building levels of frustration in response to your fear. It's like, will you not at least talk to me about it? Will you not hide away? So that was kind of counter to however you were glaring at me. I was glaring right back at you. It was like, but yeah.
It's beautiful. It's very powerful.
Five weeks.
Not long enough.
I think 28 days total.
26.
Plus 2 days.
There was a whole week lost a few months before, wasn't there?
Yes, there was.
Yeah.
Don't look at me. I wasn't here.
Yeah, it was supposed to be 6 weeks.
After we discussed every word, as Hélène said,
Yeah.
I then had to cut 10 pages of the script.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just a few weeks before we started it.
Wow.
Well, a couple of months, but it felt like a few weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not very long, just for anyone who doesn't know. That's really, really not very long.
That's exactly why we wanted to do it, to be honest.
Yeah.
We
And
wanted to go against that stereotype.
well, I think by the time we cast Kerrie, we were aware of the stereotype, but rewind a bit further back than that, and I think Hélène and I were taken aback by the fact that it wasn't. I just wrote the character of Viv, and I explained how she looked and how she was, and we found that people read the script and saw that she had a shaved head, saw that she had tattoos, etc., and they imagined a version of that character that was not our Viv, and they were worried that, again, she would be hard for audiences to kind of get behind because they had formed this sort of stereotypical image of a dyke in their mind. And it was really surprising to me because in the stage directions, it always said that she was hard on the outside, soft on the inside, like a Tunnock's tea cake. And I just thought it was so clear. That was there from the very first draft. So only after we started getting that feedback did I become aware of the fact that it was rare and the fact that people were expecting something. There was a surprise also when we cast Kerrie, and I remember people being surprised, like, oh, she's actually really soft and she's this and she's that. And that was always how I intended the character to be, but people just had jumped to conclusions about what a dyke might be like. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we were aware of it, but it was more that for me the surprise element of how people would form that character. You know, Viv was exactly how I always imagined she would be.
I feel like generally speaking, people struggle to understand, having seen so many stereotypes of like the lesbian, they just struggle to understand the nuance and the how you can be hard on the outside and soft on the inside. That was just like blowing their mind. And it was the same with Jean. It was just like, how can she be, you know, cold, but also like, you know, like fun at times. And like, it was just too complex, you know? And yeah.
Anyway, we got there in the end, but yeah, I mean,
there was a lot of like the last couple of drafts of the script was literally spelling things out for, you know, the non-aware audience, let's just say.
Very diplomatic of you, Ellen.
Also, sorry, one more thing on that. I was really keen. I was aware also that lesbian relationships as I knew them, with two people sat in their tracksuits making each other laugh and watching TV on a Saturday night, I was aware that that was not something that I had ever seen, really. Mm-hmm. And so that was a conscious thing, was just, I think at one point, very first draft, Jean met the girlfriend, but then I just decided that it had to be that we were going straight in and that we had to imagine, which is what you get with every other movie most of the time. You have to imagine how people, but I was aware that we hadn't really seen much of that.
But that goes back to the choice of having Jean as a teacher and not an activist at that time, and featuring a normal person as the hero, as the protagonist of the film, as opposed to portraying someone who is like, you know, an easier character for like a mainstream audience to get behind. And yeah, that's something that we felt we hadn't seen before either.
Yeah, I mean, that side of things was definitely just an observation from my own life, looking at queer relationships that I was familiar with, where one person was kind of more comfortable wearing their queerness on their sleeve and flying the flag in everyday life, and one person was maybe a little bit more reserved with their identity. And I was interested in the assumption that one is right and one is wrong, and kind of digging into that. And also I was interested in how Jean is struggling, obviously, with who she is. So, but even for somebody who isn't, if you decide that you would rather just kind of blend in, unfortunately, that is a luxury that most queer people don't have, and that you're actually forced to politicize your own life because of tiny things that happen every day, like in the film. But also, you know, I always use the example of when we were filming, we'd always have, like, we'd be in a taxi half the time, Kerrie's always saying, and you'd have these long chats with the taxi driver, and I had a really great chat with this taxi driver for like 40 minutes on the way to work. And at the very end of that chat, and I really felt that we'd kind of, you know, got somewhere, I told him all about the film, told him it was about lesbians, and he then at the end was like, so when will your husband be coming to visit you? And I was like, and it's just that thing where you're like, I don't really want to do this right now. I'm in a rush. I'm trying to do a shot list in the back of the car. I'm late, blah, blah, blah. But also I kind of have to, because if I don't say this and I don't create this moment of awkwardness for this guy, then I will regret it for the rest of the day, or I'll feel uncomfortable for the rest of the day that I just went, Tuesday. And that thing of having to kind of being forced to politicize your very existence is something that I'm interested in. And I guess that, so yeah, the dynamic between the two of them was something kind of lifted from my own experiences.
We need to wrap up, but I don't want to end without putting in the room how incredible the reception to the film has been so far. So Venice Film Festival, London Film Festival, BIFA wins, British Independent Film Award wins, BAFTA nomination. Rather rapturous response tonight. Just anything to close with in terms of how it feels to move people. To all of you. Quickly.
Just that when we were freezing in Newcastle last January, I had no idea that it would go this far. So just the fact that people are watching it and sharing and engaging with this story feels like more than we could have hoped for.
Beautiful.
And yeah, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. We don't have adverts on the side of buses and things like that. So if anybody in here was moved by what they saw, please tell somebody else and encourage people to go and see it, because the more people that see it, then there's a higher chance of the people who really need to see it, seeing it, if you see what I mean. And that is really important for us. So spread the word.
Thank you so much, Kerrie, Rosie, Hélène and Georgia.